Portrait of Queen Victoria that hangs in the National Portrait Gallery shows a woman of immense dignity and moral fortitude, the symbol of a civilization bringing light to the dark corners of the globe. But if you looked at the raw financial ledgers of her government in 1839, you would not see the records of a civilized monarchy. You would see the accounting books of a criminal enterprise, because beneath the veneer of Victorian morality, the British Empire was operating the largest and most sophisticated drug trafficking ring in human history. If you're sensing this reveals the darkest secret of the British Empire, hit that subscribe button now, because what Queen Victoria's government did to China will shock you. To understand this moral collapse, you must understand the terrifying economics of tea. By the 19th century, the British public had developed an addiction that was almost pathological. Tea was not just a drink, it was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. It was the only thing that made 14-hour shifts in the dark mills of Manchester bearable. The British government relied on tea tax revenue to build battleships and pay civil servants. But there was a catastrophic flaw. The tea plant only grew in China, and the Qing emperor had absolutely no interest in British products. He did not want their wool because his people wore silk. He did not want their mechanical clocks because his astronomers had mapped the stars centuries before. The emperor made it clear he would accept only one form of payment for his precious leaves: silver. For decades, the British Empire was literally bleeding its wealth into the Orient. Ships laden with millions of ounces of silver sailed from London to Canton and returned with nothing but crates of dried vegetation. The trade imbalance was a hemorrhage threatening to bankrupt the Bank of England. The directors of the East India Company looked at their balance sheets and realized if they did not find a way to get that silver back, the empire would collapse under its own debt. They needed a product the Chinese could not refuse. They needed a commodity that would bypass the logic of the market and tap into the darker logic of human biology. They found opium. Before we reveal the industrial scale of this criminal operation, smash that like button if you are realizing empires are built on addiction. The production of this poison was not left to private criminals. It was organized with the cold bureaucratic efficiency of a government department. In the fertile plains of Bengal, the British colonial administration established a monopoly. They forced tens of thousands of Indian farmers to plow over their food crops and plant vast fields of poppies. The processing factories at Patna and Gazipur were industrial cathedrals of narcotics. Visitors described seeing thousands of earthen jars stacked to the ceiling, each filled with thick black opium paste. They described armies of local workers waist-deep in the drug, churning it in massive vats to ensure consistent potency. This was the genius of the British system. They applied the standards of the Industrial Revolution to the production of illegal narcotic. They standardized the size of the balls. They stamped each cake of opium with the official seal of the East India Company, just as they would stamp a bar of gold. It was a product of the state. But the gentlemen in London faced a legal problem. The sale of opium was strictly prohibited in China. The penalty for trafficking was death by strangulation. The British government could not be seen directly violating the laws of a sovereign nation, so they created a system of plausible deniability that was as cynical as it was effective. The East India Company did not sail the ships to China. Instead, they sold the drugs at public auctions in Kolkata to private traders. These men were the smugglers. Men like William Jardine, a Scottish physician turned merchant who possessed a brilliant mind and a total absence of a moral compass. Jardine and his partners bought the government opium, loaded it on the fast clipper ships heavily armed with cannons, and sailed to the Pearl River Delta. There they anchored off remote islands and turned their ships into floating warehouses. They bribed local officials. They armed local gangs. They created a distribution network that moved the poison from British ships into the veins of the Chinese people. And the silver came flooding back. The plan worked perfectly. The silver that Britain paid for tea was recaptured by opium smugglers and deposited back into the British banking system. The trade deficit was fixed. The empire was saved. But the cost was the slow-motion assassination of Chinese society. By 1838, the British were smuggling 40,000 chests of opium a year into China. That is roughly 5 million pounds of pure narcotic paste. The impact was apocalyptic. Reports from Chinese officials describe entire villages where men had ceased to work because they spent their days inhaling smoke. The army was rotting from the inside because soldiers were selling their muskets to buy the drug. The bureaucracy was paralyzed because magistrates were high. The silver, that was the lifeblood of the Chinese economy, was vanishing, causing inflation and poverty that triggered famines and unrest. The Qing Emperor Daguang watched as his empire began to crumble, not from an invasion of soldiers, but from an invasion of addiction. In a moment of desperate resolve, the emperor appointed Lin Zexu, a scholar and poet known as Blue Sky Lin, because his integrity was as clear as the heavens. He was given a sword and a mandate to wipe the curse of opium from the Middle Kingdom. Lin Zexu arrived in Canton in March 1839. He did not come to negotiate. He came to destroy the cartel. He launched a crackdown breathtaking in its speed and severity. He arrested thousands of dealers. He rounded up tens of thousands of addicts. But Lin knew arresting victims was not enough. He had to cut off the head of the snake. He had to go after the British. He issued an ultimatum to the foreign merchants. Hand over every ounce of opium and sign a bond promising never to smuggle again. When the British tried to stall, Lin deployed troops to surround the foreign quarter. He built barricades. He cut off food and water. He beat drums all night, denying them sleep. He turned their luxurious trading post into a prison. Trapped inside, Captain Charles Elliot realized he had lost. Fearing for his countrymen's lives, Elliot ordered merchants to surrender their stock. He promised them the British government would reimburse them for their losses. Lin Zexu seized over 20,000 chests of British opium. This was a mountain of drugs with a street value of millions. Lin did not sell it. He did not repurpose it. He ordered 3 massive trenches dug on the beach. He had the opium balls crushed and thrown in. Then he mixed in lime, salt, and water. The chemical reaction caused the mixture to boil and sizzle, turning the precious narcotic into useless toxic sludge. Then at low tide, he opened the sluice gates and washed the poison into the sea. It took 23 days to destroy it all. While workers stirred the boiling pits, Lin composed a letter to Queen Victoria. It is a document that serves as the moral tombstone of the 19th century. He wrote to her not as a barbarian to a civilized monarch, but as a man of conscience to a woman he hoped shared his values. He asked her a question that still echoes through history. I am told that in your own country, opium smoking is strictly forbidden. Under these circumstances, how can you bear to let it be rolled out to poison other lands? The letter was never answered. We do not know if Queen Victoria ever saw it. When news reached London, the drug dealers did not hide in shame. They went on the offensive. William Jardine traveled to London and began a lobbying campaign. He met with Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston. He unfolded maps of the Chinese coast. He pointed to deep water harbors and defenseless cities. He argued the Chinese had insulted the British flag. He argued the destruction of the opium was a violation of the sacred principles of free trade. He promised that a small fleet of modern warships could bring the Celestial Empire to its knees in weeks. The British government was broke. They needed the tea tax. They needed the silver. And now they had a bill for $20 million from their own merchants for the destroyed drugs. They had to make a choice. Accept the loss and respect China's laws, or go to war to force the Chinese to pay for the poison they had destroyed. They chose war. The fleet that sailed to China in summer 1840 was more than a military expedition. It was the physical manifestation of the Industrial Revolution, weaponized for organized crime. At the head was a ship called the Nemesis, the first auction-going iron warship in history, powered by steam engines. To Chinese defenders, it looked like a monster from a nightmare. Their navy consisted of wooden junks with cannons unchanged since the Ming Dynasty. The collision was not a battle. It was an execution. The British strategy was simple and ruthless. They did not attempt to conquer the vast interior. They simply strangled it. They bombarded forts and occupied key ports. They seized tax barges carrying grain to Beijing, threatening the capital with starvation. Chinese cannonballs bounced harmlessly off the iron hull of the Nemesis. Their wooden fleets were set ablaze by rockets. By summer 1842, the British fleet had sailed up the Yangtze River and trained guns on Nanking. They threatened to burn the city if the emperor did not surrender. Faced with annihilation, the emperor capitulated. On August 29, 1842, Chinese officials boarded the HMS Cornwallis. There, under the shadow of British guns, they signed the Treaty of Nanking. The Treaty of Nanking is known in China as the first of the unequal treaties. The British demanded China pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars. 6 million specifically to pay for the opium that Lin Zexu had destroyed. The British government forced the Chinese government to pay for the drugs smuggled into their country against their laws. It was a gangster protection racket on the stage of international diplomacy. But the money was only part of the price. The treaty forced China to open 5 treaty ports where British merchants could live without being subject to Chinese laws. And most fatefully, it forced the emperor to cede a rocky island to the British crown in perpetuity. That island was Hong Kong. In the years following, the opium trade did not just resume, it exploded. By the 1880s, the British were selling over 6,000 tons of opium to China every year. The revenue from this trade became the financial backbone of the British Raj in India. It paid for the railways, it paid for the civil service, it paid for the navy, the Pax Britannica. The great era of British peace and prosperity was underwritten by the addiction of millions of Chinese peasants. The psychological impact on China was even more devastating than the economic cost. The Opium War shattered the Chinese worldview. For thousands of years, they had viewed themselves as the center of the world. Now they had been brought low by a nation of drug pushers. This trauma birthed a century of humiliation, a period of internal chaos, civil war, and foreign domination lasting until the mid-20th century. It is the scar that defines modern China. What of the men who orchestrated this crime? William Jardine returned to London a hero. He was elected to Parliament. His partner, James Matheson, became a baronet and one of the largest landowners in Britain. The company they founded, Jardine Matheson & Co., evolved into one of the great trading houses that built modern Hong Kong. If you walk through the financial district of Hong Kong today, you will see the legacy of the drug trade written in the skyline. The Opium War proves that the line between a legitimate government and a criminal enterprise is often just a matter of who has the bigger navy. It teaches us that free trade is a noble concept that can be twisted into a weapon of exploitation. Queen Victoria sat on her throne for 63 years, a symbol of virtue and grace. But the jewels in her crown were polished with silver, drained from a dying empire, and the tea in her cup was steeped in the tragedy of a nation brought to its knees. If this revealed the darkest secret of the British Empire, subscribe. Hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Should Britain apologize for the Opium Wars? Join us as we uncover the crimes hidden in history books. Thank you for watching.